Hey Joe. Yeah,
Hey, Luke.
I'm gonna dive right into this. Um,
All right, let's
what
do
do you
it.
think? I got a couple questions here for you. Um, I want to kind of get your take. What do you think the total assets of the United States government is?
Total assets.
Total assets as
Well,
per as per this report.
right. Well, I mean, is
This one.
okay. Financial report. I mean, what Treasury market's like $27 trillion, and I think that's the marketable debt. And the other side, and then the non-marketable, the other debt pieces are like 6 trillion, I think. So somewhere in the 30s.
Okay, 3 trillion, not bad. What about total liabilities? You think that's still
Well, I think I just mentioned the liabilities. I think that's
right?
like
So we'll take
33
that as
trillion.
30 trillion. All right. What was our budget deficit 2023?
I think just over a trillion.
Okay. And then
It's either
here's a
800
curveball.
billion, I think, or I think this year might have been 1.1 trillion or so.
What is our net operating cost? There's a curveball.
Cost. Well, interest on treasuries are now crossing the $1 trillion a year mark. So it's far beyond that.
Yes. Okay. Far beyond. I'll put that down. All right. Last question. What do you think the net present value of the total tax revenue of the United States is?
Net
Assuming,
present value of
assuming,
the
yeah,
tax.
assuming the U.S. does not collapse in the next, call it, 150 years.
Mhm. Uh, so per year, right?
So the net present value of all those cash flows.
Uh, well, let's see. Um, somewhere in
That's a
the
tough one. That's a tough one.
yeah,
There's a lot of
some
layers to that one.
yeah, somewhere in
All
the
right. Well,
I
that's
don't know.
good because that means I got something I think to teach you then.
Oh, I think you do.
It would be a problem if you knew all the answers.
All right. Yep.
All right, let's get to it. So these are the things that I pulled directly from the presentation. This I just wanted to kind of give a nature of the inflows and the outflows. So this one over here, this is not by like these are not 20 trillion. It's 20% of GDP. So this is by percentage GDP,
Mhm.
and you can just see that the nature of the outflows. Most of it is just huge chunks in defense, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And then there's this
Sorry. So,
other.
I'm trying to get a closer look at this. Break this down. This is historical and current policy projections for receipts, non-interest spending, net interest, and total spending. 80
Yep.
to
So we got
well,
2023. Got
2098. All right.
projections. Yeah.
All
So
right.
we got a couple spikes here. So this is the other non-interest spending. So over here, I guess that's the stimulus package after 2008. This must be the COVID package. And this is probably
Mm-hmm.
what caused the inflation. Here's that 90s. This black line right here is the total receipts. So that's the income. We had a surplus back in the 90s, and that was the last time that we saw a surplus. And then really the point of this chart in the report was just to show that like we do not have a sustainable deficit because we got to fill everything this with
What is that
borrowing.
red bar on top? It's a little difficult to see
The red
the
bar
list.
says other non-interest spending. So and then the clear one is just straight up interest.
Got it.
So like you look at the expenses, and the main chunks are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, and more recently interest. So that's
Yeah.
what spending
The
looks like. The other kind of the interesting thing that I got out of this also is of all of them, they're kind of consistent if you just sort of eyeball it, except for things like Medicaid and Medicare. So it looks like those as a percentage of GDP, those just kind of eyeballing it, seem to be the ones that are growing. Defense was a lot bigger. Looks like in the 80s, kind of shrank a little bit. But even with the Iraq war, stuff like that, there's not like a huge bulge here.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that is pretty substantial. Yeah, I mean, what is that? Maybe, what,
Well,
like
it's
three
not like
percent
these
increase?
spikes, right? I mean, it's not like Iraq War and then it turned into one
Well,
of these
yeah,
spikes.
yeah,
Um, but these like stimulus packages or something else.
yeah,
And
because
like
defense spending, it's like the budget every year, right? They don't say the flat out number. They say how much do we want to increase or decrease it. So you just get little bumps here and there. Whereas those spikes, it was like, all right, let's go spend trillions of dollars out of nowhere.
right, right. So that's where the money's going. And then in terms of where the money's coming from, it's sort of three main buckets that they come up with. The vast majority of the tax revenue is individual income from like people, from payroll taxes. It's not really like corporate income taxes. Almost, it's like 10x. It's so when people are like, "Oh, we're going to tax companies more to like close the deficit," that's you could almost certainly call it BS.
It's
It's just
laughable.
like it's just not a big enough pie to pull from.
Hmm.
Um, this other revenue one is kind of interesting. Earnings, it's excise taxes, I think, and customs duties. Those are in there.
And just to contextualize, I think the Fed net income that was sent to the Treasury in the end of the last decade is probably 2019 area. I think like an all-time high was like just over 100 billion or something like that. And in fact, it has turned negative in since 2021.
So one of the things I asked you before was like, what do you think the budget deficit is, and then what do you think our net operating costs are? And it's a bit of a curveball. But when we mostly cite the budget deficit, we're essentially using a kind of cash based accounting. So we're saying, money in and money out. But most companies require that you do sort of accrued based accounting. So when we say the budget deficit is, in this case, it's written down here, call it 1.7 trillion. This is 2023. That's really cash based. But from an accrued based perspective, the net operating costs are negative 3.4 trillion. And the vast majority of that, the difference, includes costs in the amounts that have been incurred but are not necessarily paid. So
Mm.
that's sort of how you can sort of reconcile year over year with what's happening to like the liabilities. So like if we and the vast majority of that they explain has to do around um, the assumptions that are used really in this section right here, the federal employees and veteran benefits, the payables. So as you can imagine, like they try to estimate on some level sort of how much are we going to have, how much do we owe these people? And that's, I mean, there are assumptions just all the way down, as you can imagine.
Hmm.
How long are they living? What are interest rates? So that's sort of the answer to two of those questions. One of the other things that I would add would be, if sometimes you hear the analogy that like if the government were the corporation, it would be running its losses would be 1.7 trillion a year because that's the deficit. But that's
Hmm.
not really sort of apples to apples comparison. Really, you would say the loss is like 3.4 trillion, right? So I thought that was pretty crazy. And now the other question that we asked was what we thought the total assets were for the U.S. government. I think you said 30. You said just assets and liabilities should equal each other. So right now we have total assets at 5.4. Ooh, 5.4 trillion. Ooh, and most of that is like loans, surprisingly.
Wow.
Um, then you've got the property, plant, and equipment (PP&E). You got 1.2 trillion. That's pretty good. You sell the Pentagon and like all those buildings,
Right.
probably get like
Federal
1.2
lands.
trillion. Cash monetary, almost a trillion. So, then compare that with the major chunks of the liabilities. Like, what does the US government owe? And that's really going into two huge chunks. It's debt, and you guessed that one right. You were right there. That was 26 trillion. And then the other part, and this is something I really didn't appreciate, was the size of the payable for federal employee and veterans benefits. I
Hmm.
mean,
Yeah, I thought that number was substantially smaller.
yeah, I did not know this. I did not appreciate this. So that gives us the like what our equity position. What is the equity position of the U.S. government? It's negative 37 trillion. Or is
Nice.
it? Or is it? Or is it, Joe? And this is, I think, one of the coolest parts. This is kind of what I want to get at. And it's sort of one thing you realize where it's like there is no standard accounting practices for governments, because like the total U.S. assets are not 5.4 trillion. There's something way higher. Because one of the things in here, and there's really no way to do this, although we're going to try in this episode, there's no way to really estimate what the present value is of all the tax revenue. Right? That's not on here, although it's obviously an asset. I mean, anything in which that will give you monetary benefit is considered an asset. So in that way, the entire tax base is an asset.
Right.
So, and obviously they point this out. So they'll say like other significant government resources not reported on the balance sheet, and they list off some pretty big items. The ability to tax is a big one. They say set monetary policy. The natural resources are not on here. Stewardship assets. So like, how much do you think we could get if we tried to sell Yosemite National Park or something? Like the Liberty Bell or something.
Right.
So like this has been pointed out. I was kind of like researching this, and you'll find something like this, and then this jerk comes along and says, "Oh well, technically the net worth of the USA exceeds 100 trillion," and then it like linked to FRED economic data, and then like you see the responses to his tweet. There are going to be people being like, "Excuse me, I'm not owned by the U.S. government." Oh. Typical that these people would think that the U.S. government owns us and all that. And quite frankly, they have a point. It's like if you tried to just add up all the assets in the U.S., so never mind what the U.S. government owns, but if you tried to add up all the assets of everyone in the United States and somehow tried to say that those belong also to the government and belong in their balance sheet, that's BS. That's
right.
total
It's not
BS.
that the government owns it. It's the country owns it, of which, if you're a citizen, you are a part of that.
Yeah. But that's a huge distinction, right? The government is not the country. I think people get that confused. I think we can still just do some basic present value calculations and try to figure out through a couple assumptions what is the value of the power to tax. What I made here is just sort of a way to calculate present value. Going back to finance class, you just take like a cash flow in the future and then you give it a discount, and then the farther out it is, the bigger the discount, because you're putting stuff to the power 100 or whatever, however many years.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you just kind of add those all up and you'll see they just sort of asymptote at a certain line. So let's just draw a couple assumptions here. So I got 4.5 trillion. That's like roughly what our tax revenue was in 2023. Let's call it 3% interest rate. Anything against that? That seems to be kind of the long run rate. So that'll put you at like the present value to be about 150 trillion. So it's like if our sort of total liabilities, I think we came up at like 40 trillion or something. You're looking at an asset base of like 5 trillion, which we showed, plus like 150 trillion. So if you look at it from this perspective, it looks a little better. And then just to kind of give you a sense of what happens if we change around some of the assumptions. If instead of 3%, it's 4%, then your asymptote is still at about 112.5 trillion. And then if we decide somehow we're able to raise more revenue from taxes to 6 billion, then you're looking at a cool 200 trillion.
I mean, I think it's definitely not a common way of thinking about how to describe the government. It's like on that last question, I didn't quite know what to say. I never really thought about it in that explicit terms.
Really
like, hear about the deficit, hear about the amount of debt, but yeah, and then I was like, oh, the assets, just the other side of the liabilities.
Right. The U.S. government is totally insolvent, but not really. It's like nobody's really serious about these accounting rules. So
Right.
they're just kind of like, whatever. Maybe they should be. It's funny. I mean, you buy U.S. government debt, but you don't have any financials that mean anything.
I wanted to just kind of meander a little bit at what was going on in the news, um, namely this dock workers strike
Yeah.
that began and minutes before this recording started has apparently ended. So, well, yeah, it said that it's been postponed until January 15th. So,
I mean, how does
not
that
really
even?
sure. And like, there's nothing but the headline that came right before we got on here. So, I really don't have, I'm not sure if anyone has any context on what that means, how they got there. Is this just going to happen again in January, after January 15, or what's going on? But otherwise, I just thought this was kind of an interesting topic and wanted to just give a little bit of background about what it is and hopefully put some numbers around it that could ultimately have a real impact. The East Coast longshoremen dock workers is the name of this um, labor union for dock workers on the East Coast and down on the Gulf Coast. There's a separate one over on the West Coast. These are the kind of jobs that have been very much in demand since COVID. They were quite a bit of volatility there just based on how supply chains completely stopped and then totally started up again. So the current starting salary for a dock worker in this union is $39 an hour. So that comes out to roughly, just over $80,000 a year. It's not too bad, but this type of profession is earns overtime pay, and the vast majority of these workers work frequent overtime. So there's some statistic roughly the majority of workers actually make over $100,000 a year. And I think something like 10% at the very top, those are like those that are working like 100-hour weeks, real crazy, or making over $200,000 a year consistently. This past Tuesday, October 1, was the end of their most recent 6-year contract. So these things, keep rolling I don't know if they're 6 years every time, but, this one finished up. And so they were trying to renegotiate it. And they've got a pretty gruff leader of the party, or of the party, of the workers union. A couple of quotes I wrote down, which was I thought was a pretty good reflection of who this guy is. Apparently, 3 weeks before, he was quoted as saying that it would, quote, cripple the U.S. economy. And then he
Mm-hmm.
said, quote, "You have no idea what that means. Nobody does." So, like, in one sense, he was very threatening, but in another sense, he was acknowledging how the amount of uncertainty behind his threats, and he just doesn't quite care. But that said, I don't know exactly, all of the history behind it, but that's kind of where we're at right now. End of a contract, $39 an hour. So then that raises the question, well, it's like, well, what was in the negotiation? On the other side of this, by the way, is this U.S. Maritime Alliance, or the USMX. I've never heard of these people before. Have you?
No, I know the words, but
Yeah,
no, they're
it
not.
kind of threw
They're
me out.
not a
Like, it
household
sounded
name.
like almost sounded like a government entity or something like that, and did a little. And apparently, it's just a alliance of container carriers, direct employers, and port associations serving the east and Gulf coasts of the U.S. So that's just like on the front page of their website. So it's a little bit opaque as to what this other side is, but apparently it's just well, those employing the dock workers. So those that are actually coordinating all of the movement of infrastructure through these docks.
And they're all like 36 ports or whatever. Those aren't owned by one company. They're all separate companies.
That's
It's
my
just the
understanding.
union
So
that sort of
it's, yeah, like
covers.
on this website, it says it's an alliance of container carriers. So I don't know what the legal
Okay.
framework's like, but it sounds not too formal.
Okay.
But at any rate, so I don't know where they started, but their latest offer was something like just under 40% increase in wages over the next 6 years. That was turned down, and then I think like last week, like just ahead of it starting, and this is coming after some public comment, like some coaxing from government in public ways, like President Biden was saying, basically trying to nudge them along to, increase the offer, and then it landed on a 50% wage increase over the following 6 years. That was also rejected, and then at the time that the strike had begun, the dock workers or the unions ask, the counter ask was, or as it stood at that time, was 77% wage increase over the coming 6 years. So divided up over a few years, that's a pretty good chunk guaranteed price increase, or wage increase every year.
Yeah.
So that sounds substantial. Just thinking about the U.S. national average, looking at wage growth, just going like to the BLS, just some really back of the envelope numbers I looked up, and on average throughout the country since 2020, the average wage increase was about 24%. So just about what inflation has been. So basically, Americans are no better off, since 2020, more or less, in terms of real spending power. So they're asking for 77% over 6 years. When I looked over the past 7 years, the average wage increase has been 39%. And then if you keep looking backward, it takes until 2011 until the national average rises to about a 78% increase. So in a very crude way, they're basically asking for twice the national average, or the amount of the national average in half the amount of time. On top of, and that said, the starting salary is already quite a bit above the median salary in the United States, which I think is somewhere in the 50s at the moment. I'm still learning about this topic quite a bit myself. I was curious about it, but that's just kind of to contextualize like where they're at and what they're asking for. So it's it just, at least the way I interpreted it, it didn't seem like they have an especially raw deal, but this could very well just be my ignorance on the issue. But then I started thinking about what would be the impact of this kind of thing. So on East Coast ports, it's like the questions you ask, like, all right, well, what's coming in, how much is coming in, what's the value of these goods coming in, all this kind of stuff. And the short answer is they really import like a bit of everything. It's the whole East Coast of the United States. It's not just a single item. It's all fresh produce. It's parts to make industrial equipment, like including things like cars, and luxury goods as well. Like one of the big ones, like I saw, was like European wines and stuff like that. More kind of miscellaneous luxury goods as well. So really like a little bit of everything. So there's been a bunch of like estimates out there of like, all right, well, if all these things stop coming in, what's that going to do to commerce in the US? And it's subject to a lot of assumptions, particularly that this was an event that was highly anticipated. So and like especially in October, that people knew was starting. So coming up to the holiday season, so many suppliers were like preload or front loading a lot of imports at that time to kind of build things up.
Is that
So as
right?
I understand it, given all these assumptions, one of the common numbers that's been floating around is about $4.5 billion a day. That it would subtract from GDP. How do you contextualize those numbers compared to the government, which is, I think, just under 30 trillion? You're looking at like 0.1% of GDP per day. That's a huge number, but compared to the country size as a whole, not really. But I think what really would have been the issue was that for this kind of event, there would not be a constant rate of, let's call it losses, or, lost commerce, or whatever you want to say. And if this thing is telegraphed, it's, it's man-made. It's not like some disaster happened and it came out of nowhere and people were unprepared like COVID. But this was something that was known, so people, both individuals and companies alike, started buying lots of things ahead of time. So at the starts, the impact would be relatively limited. Given that these things would be accelerating, once you run through the inventory that you have, things would get presumably would get much worse, much more quickly. And it's very difficult to try to scientifically nail down what that rate of change would be. But again, some very finger in the air estimates that have been going around is that, a few days wouldn't really mean much. And that's exactly where we're at today. It only made it into 3 days. So I guess lucky for us, nothing really happened. Dock workers missed a few days of pay, and that's probably about it. But if this went on for multiple weeks, then it would get to the point where it doesn't matter how much produce you bought ahead of time, it's going to go bad after a week or two. That would be significant, to significant detriment both to people in the United States trying to eat it, as well as to exporters around the world. I don't doubt they couldn't find somewhere else to send it, but they would incur new costs trying to find new buyers, all these kinds of things. So it would also have these much larger effects. And then similarly, in terms of like industrial equipment, same thing. If you kind of stockpile a lot of the pieces involved, whenever you're talking about something like making a car or making some large piece of industrial equipment, you can't have 99% of the pieces. You have to have 100% of the parts. So even if there's some, or I think it's referred to as the golden screw problem. If you're missing the one last screw from trying to make, you can't make any cars anymore. And now all of a sudden, if you can't make any cars, there's nothing for the workers to do. They're going to get laid, they're going to at least be furloughed. They could be laid off. There's nothing for car salesmen to sell. They're going to be laid off. And then prices for existing cars are going to go through the roof, and people are going to have to pay for those things. And then they're not going to have money to buy anything else. And then everyone else is going to, incomes would be lowered. And then, you could be quickly looking at some sort of recessionary territory. But it's really difficult to try to figure out exactly when that would happen. But people said on the order of weeks. So in one sense, that seems like plenty of time to, go to negotiate some sort of amicable outcome. But in another sense, it could be potentially dire consequences. And these negotiations have been going on for, I don't know. I mean, the contract was 6 years. They definitely didn't start just thinking about it 1 month ago.
Right.
So it's then you start to think, it's like, how far would this thing really go? And then, it could go potentially far enough to where the workers themselves, their lives are being destroyed as well. So
Yeah.
For something that's kind of self-induced, there would have to be some sort of natural stopping point as well. Or
You
at least
think
that's the way I started thinking about it.
you think the alliance, the companies could automate everything in 2 months? Or do you think the union would get
Definitely not in 2 months.
that's what you hear about. Yeah, probably not in 2 months.
Oh, and then actually, that was the other thing I forgot to mention when I gave a little bit of background. I thought this was, just kind of like an interesting point. And again, I don't know if it means anything anymore because this might be already finished. But so their primary things was pay, it was two things. So like the pay that I was talking about, but the other piece that they were concerned with automation. So they wanted clearer terms with how to limit automation, with the intent of protecting their workers. So given the past couple of years in the popular press talking about all these things like AI, these new technologies, ChatGPT, Apple's making augmented reality glasses, Facebook's working on it too. It seems like, it's great. It's going to change the world and all these things. And it seems like that's definitely where they're coming from as well. But at the same time, it's like, well, how can you enforce that? Like,
Right.
Why?
Yeah, I mean, you're sort of, it sounds like from the point of view of the head of the labor union, it sounds like you're just giving them a really, really good reason to push forward with the automation. But it's like, you don't really have, you're just a huge hammer. You don't really have any other tools here.
Pretty much.
Other than strike.
And so it's based upon, it's like you got to inflict sharp pain like that quickly. And
I'll add, what had kind of just occurred to me. You've seen them. I saw a clip or whatever. I think it was a Chinese port Just have people in a big room moving the shipping containers, by joystick on six or whatever different screens. But then they look Chinese, so they're probably in China or at least even at the port.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know that there are, I think, construction companies in which you can have an excavator be piloted automatically, but you can do it with someone in like, I think it was like a German company even. There were like Germans
Mm-hmm.
that were building something in
Right,
like
right.
Vietnam or something. And like that's what their company does. Is it just so I mean there's no even reason why the longshoremen, if in fact that's what they do,
Right.
they even need to be at the port. They could just be in like a cozy room, I don't know, in the middle of the country, or not even in the country,
Mm-hmm.
and do it. So that's not, I guess, technically automation, but it's definitely a risk to their jobs.
You can look at it combatively and try to fight it, or you can say, all right, we're going to sit in cozy rooms and handle the joysticks now. That makes sense, and that's probably what will happen, and I think is an underway and will continue to. But
Yeah,
in people's everyday lives, it's very different. Like that's a substantial change. Like the dock worker 10 years from now, who's not even an adult yet, perhaps that's where they start their career,
yeah,
versus someone else that's already been doing it 20 years now. It's not to say that they couldn't do that; they absolutely could. But in reality, what percentage of workers realistically would? I think is typically the issue. I mean, people have been having similar conversations in a place like California, where they've been aggressively raising the minimum wage, even in like New York City. Like some
yeah,
of the like fast food
yeah,
workers are getting $20 an hour minimum wage, and um, like a lot of the so large companies like McDonald's, they've got the capital to kind of cushion for those things,
yeah,
but especially in California, smaller chains, they don't they just they can't employ as many working hours um, um, anymore. And so when you kind of extrapolate that, you think about like like similar to what we were just saying, using a joystick to move around the
yeah.
shipping containers.
I
In
mean,
the future, like a fast food worker could be a
you can export the labor. Yeah,
highly skilled technician somewhere, in some
yeah.
remote area, like
Mm-hmm.
one person operating 10 McDonald's simultaneously or something crazy like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's an interesting point. It's either push the work onto the consumer. That's another sort of trend that we've seen for like the last decade or whatever, having to do with like self checkout lanes,
Hmm.
right? So there's that joke, oh, there's a self checkout lane open. I'm sorry, I don't work here. Um, so,
Yeah. I didn't come here to
uh,
work.
yeah, right.
I'm
So
already
there's like
paying.
that component of it. There's, literally just exporting the labor if you need like an individual off to some country. So I remember there was, I think, an episode of like the All In podcast. Um, they were going to make, you can do online gambling. They're doing online blackjack, but they have like real dealers. It's like a
Oh
video
yeah.
of like a real dealer, but the dealer
Hmm.
is in like some warehouse, upstairs, I guess, from other people who are doing other webcam stuff, probably. And they're literally just standing there like dealing cards, and you can't
Wow.
imagine that. It looked like he looked just like a kid.
Hmm.
And you could, and then the other example that I mentioned about using an excavator from the other side of the planet, just joystick. I mean, why not? You just need like a video link, and then just like playing a video game
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a
to
threat,
them.
but and then the counterpoint is though, like typically whenever a new technology comes about, there's a lot of euphoria, and then it gets overdone. And
Mm-hmm.
considering all of that, his estimate was that in terms of GDP effect over the longer term, he thinks current AI technology will have something like a 5% increase in productivity to GDP. So really quite minimal. GDP growth itself is 2 to 3% a year in the U.S. So you get a little bump from AI. If he turns out to be truly, or, if that's true, then possibly this bargaining over automation and AI that this, that's, whether it's in fast food, like we were saying, or with the dock workers here, it might not really even matter that much. Perhaps in people get excited about new technologies, but whenever it comes down to the real world, you're applying it anywhere else. It's probably isn't going to have that much effect over the short term, at least. Now,
Think so?
30 years from now, who knows? There's probably going to be new
Short term,
technology.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, so
All right.
back to the dock workers here. And so again, this probably doesn't mean that much anymore since it might be over. But the last thing I was just kind of thinking about is whenever this happens, like what can be done? I didn't find too many concrete things, but the one that is commonly cited is that so there is some presidential power involved with this as well, actually. And so there's so I guess a law was passed in 1947 under Harry Truman, the Taft-Hartley Act, 1947. Effectively, it gives presidential power, or it gives presidents the ability to restrict the power of unions, and that's and so I think the concrete number is that they can invoke like a 80-day cooling off period of, between negotiations. So basically saying, you have to stop this for at least 80 days.
What? Really?
Yeah. So my knowledge there
Is that
is
what they
pretty limited
did?
still, but
I
just,
mean,
so that seems, or at least it's
how do
been
they
spoken
possibly
about the
enforce
most.
that? I thought the whole point of the strike is like you can't make us do that under or like what the military comes in.
Yeah. Now at that point, I'm really not sure, but just in terms of, I guess, legal precedent, the president can tell you what to do, which kind of makes sense. If there was a national emergency, that would make a lot of sense. But, we're in
Okay,
relative
under penalty
peacetime.
of jail time. Is that what they're saying?
Yeah. So again, I don't
They
know how
arrest
the
them.
enforcement would work, but,
Uh,
just super high level. But,
Interesting. I didn't know that.
so that's actually not what happened, though. So, it
Oh,
could
it's not.
be a number of reasons for that. So the president and the current administration overall is extremely pro-union. So
Yeah.
it would be a little bit surprising if they did do that, especially just ahead of the election here. And given such a huge voting base, they probably wouldn't want to make them angry. And in fact, what was done is quite limited, but Biden came out with some public statement on the first day um, of the strike earlier this week. And basically, this like short 2.5 paragraph statement uh, you know, um, that just came down very much on the side of the dock workers union. Like I found a little bit surprising. Maybe I'll just read it really quick. But so the whole thing says collective bargaining is the best way for workers to get the pay and benefits that they deserve. I have urged the USMX, which represents a group of foreign owned carriers, to come to the table and present a fair offer to workers of the International Longshoremen's Association that ensures they are paid appropriately in line with their invaluable contributions. And then it goes on to say ocean carriers have made record profits since the pandemic, and in some cases, have grown in excess of 800% compared to their profits prior to the pandemic. And then going down that line, of course, executive compensation has grown in line with those profits, and profits have been returned to shareholders at record rates. It's only fair that workers who put themselves at risk during the pandemic to keep ports open see a meaningful increase in their wages as well. So, and then the last paragraph reads, as our nation climbs out of the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, or Helen, actually, I don't even know how to say it. So that's the other complication here, though, is this major storm has affected things a little bit, but I guess clearly not enough to invoke something like this. And he says dock workers will play an essential role in communities to get these resources. Now is not the time for ocean carriers to refuse to negotiate a fair wage while they're raking in record profits. Then it finishes by saying, my administration will be monitoring for any price gouging activities, and it's time for the USMX to negotiate a fair contract with longshoremen that reflects the substantial contribution they've been making to our economic comeback. So maybe not too surprising, just given how pro-union the Democratic Party is today, but it almost seemed a little striking to me just how, uh,
Yeah, it's all pro.
yeah, like very,
Yeah.
very curt,
I mean, the line
very
that
black
stuck
and white
out,
into what side they're on. Like,
the line that I was laughing at was basically, I don't know if you can remember, it was at the beginning. If you could reread it,
mm-hmm.
it said something like, "We need to compensate them in that aligns with their invaluable
ensure they are paid appropriately in line with their invaluable contributions.
Yeah, so it's like, okay, invaluable. So infinite amount. Like, what is? I don't know. That's what stood out to me. But I don't. That sort of like
Right.
leads into that concept of fair. You use the word fair 100 times,
Yeah,
and it's
like
just
that,
like,
that
okay,
was word of the day. Yeah.
fair to whom? I mean,
Yeah,
anyway,
and then just like again contextualizing their current wages already you know
yeah.
25-30%
Thing
above the
is,
national median of the absolute minimum, and then any realistic amount is double the national average, roughly. It again, I'm not fully versed in the plight of uh, dock workers on the East Coast, but it didn't seem like a particularly dire situation. But again, this could just very well be some of my own ignorance of the topic. But just by those numbers alone, it's the context that it paints, a bit more of a gray area, for sure.
yeah, interesting. Fairness. That's a tough concept. Fairness.
Yeah, and not to get into government too much, but is that the role of the government to promote and enforce fairness?
Yeah, leave you all with that. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Is it the government's job to figure out fairness? The first thing I thought of was like the legal system. It's supposed to be just. That's kind of all about fair and balanced, but we're talking about
Right.
something kind of different.
All right, Luke. Good talking to
Thanks
you.
for the thanks for the info. That was some interesting
Yeah, no,
stuff.
likewise. I'll
All
be
right.
thinking about net present value of tax based
Yeah.
here.
So next time you do your taxes, just remember part of that 4.5 trillion, super important to help us, keep our balance sheet in the positive.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Keep that equity positive. All right, man.
All right. We'll see you. Until next time.